Welcome everyone to the second session of the Madwoman in the Rabbi's Attic, where we are, as with the previous week, we have had the pleasure of learning with Miss Gila Fine. She is a lecturer of rabbinic literature at the Pardes Institute of Jewish Studies, exploring the tales of the Talmud through philosophy, literary criticism, psychoanalysis, and pop culture. And with that, I'm going to hand things over.
Thank you, Kayla, very much. Hello again, Drisha. Good. I'm going to go with afternoon. I imagine you are mostly within the afternoon time frame. And I don't know, are we saying happy election day? Is that allowed? I really don't know what the mood is over there. All right, I'm seeing a lot of forlorn faces. All right, in that case, let's not talk about it. I'm going to begin by saying I do not remember whether I mentioned it last class, and if not, I was remiss. I am coming to you from Jerusalem, where it is not election day, but is a difficult place for a number of other reasons. And so, if you will allow me, I would like to dedicate our learning together to the brave men and women who are laying their lives out on the line so that I can teach you from Jerusalem in relative safety and security. Let us dive in. So, a bit of a recap, because this is in fact a series where one class builds on the other. Last week we gave a bit of an intro. I apologize. I did warn you it was going to be a lot of theory. Today is the day we do practice. Today and until the end of the series. But we had to begin with a bit of theory. We had to talk about the genre of rabbinic literature and Agadah, and how the rabbis themselves saw it, how we define it today, the distinctions to halakha, its history of composition, how it was, I won't say written, because initially these stories weren't written, they were orally composed and transmitted, how it was read throughout Jewish history, and misread, I should say, very often, and then what happened with the turn in the 20th century toward Agadah as literature, how it began to be read in very different ways, and why that had then caused a meteoric rise in the popularity of Agadah, which it is enjoying to this day. And after all of that, we were going to demonstrate it by looking at one text. And then I gave you even more theory, because we had to begin by looking, if we were going to read the story of Yalta the Shrew, we had to begin by understanding what we mean when we say shrew, by defining the archetype. And so we made our way through the notable shrews of the Western canon, and we ended up defining the archetype as the shrew is a mad woman, in the double sense of both angry and crazy, raging and deranged. She is someone who flies into fits and attacks those around her. She is the wife of a timid and terrorized husband who does his best to put up with her antics and placate her temper. She is a comedic character whose story, always told from the point of view of said suffering husband, never from her own, features scenes of verbal abuse or physical violence, oftentimes both. And with that in mind, we managed one very quick read-through of the story, but that was by no means enough. So what we're going to do is, we're going to begin this class, again, we're turning toward the great shrew of the Talmud, Yalta, who is not only the great shrew of the Talmud, she is also the most frequently named woman of the Talmud. And this is the most famous story that we have about her. The story is in Tractate Brachot, page 51b. And what we're going to do, what we must, generally do when we read stories in the Talmud, because they are oftentimes quite short and deceptively simple, is we're going to begin by reading the entire story through, beginning to end, to just get a sense of the lay of the land and what it appears to be saying. And so I'm about to share my screen, but before I do, can I ask for a volunteer reader, please? If you'd like to read, thank you, Anita. Can always rely on you. Please unmute yourself, Anita. I'm going to share my screen, and I am going to ask you to take it away with source number 18. This is going to be our primary text for the entire series. Go for it, Anita. And be warned, I will be interrupting you like always. Go.
Ula was once at the house of Rav Nachman.
Thank you. Did warn you. So, Ula was once at the house of Rav Nachman. A little bit of historical context. At the time of our story, which is the 3rd century in Babylon, the Jewish world operated around 2 rabbinic epicenters, the older one in Israel and the newer one in Babylon. These epicenters would communicate via nechute. Nechute literally means descenders, people who would descend, from Israel to Babylon and act as rabbinic messengers, transmitting words of Torah from the Batei Midrash, the study halls of Israel, to Babylon and back again. Ula was a prominent Israeli sage who often went to Babylon on business, and so he would act as one such rabbinic messenger. There are many instances we find him in the Talmud teaching Israeli Torah to Babylonian rabbis. Kayla, I'm going to ask you to please keep an eye on the waiting room. Continue, please, Anita.
He had a meal, said the grace after meals, and handed a cup of blessing to Rav Nachman.
Thank you. And so on one of his trips to Babylon, Ula is hosted by his friend and rabbinic colleague Rav Nachman. The 2 men sit down to have a meal. And once they finish, they say the blessing after meal, Birkat Hamazon, which traditionally is recited over a cup of wine. Many of you, I imagine, will have seen this custom to this day in Jewish weddings. Some of you might actually observe it in your home every Shabbat. But that is the general custom. Ula, as the guest, is given the honor of leading the blessing. And so he says the blessing, he drinks on the wine, and then he passes the cup to his host, Rav Nachman, who also drinks. Continue, please.
Rav Nachman said to him, Master, please send the cup of blessing to Yalta.
Thank you. And then Rav Nachman says, please send the cup to my wife. Let me ask you, and please do answer by chat, where is Yalta, do you think, based on the way this request is phrased? It's true that we don't know. We're not being told. Good, Ariel. I think that is correct. I think she's somewhere in the house, and I think significantly she's not actually at the table, because the Aramaic word used for the verb send, lishdar, implies that it had to be sent, meaning she's not actually, he doesn't say pass the cup, he says send the cup, which implies that the woman was not actually at the table with the men, and that is per the social conventions at the time where men and women would often eat separately. Continue, please, Anita.
Ula responded, so said Rabbi Yochanan, the fruit of a woman's body is blessed only from the fruit of a man's body, as it is written, he will bless the fruit of your body. It does not say the fruit of her body, but the fruit of your body.
Thank you. So Ula, ever the rabbinic messenger, sees this as a perfect opportunity to teach his Babylonian friend some words of Israeli Torah. So he says, according to Rabbi Yochanan, the great rabbi back in Israel, women do not drink from the cup of blessing. Can anyone tell me what his rationale for this is? He actually presents a reason. Does anyone understand what the reason is? Again, please do answer by chat. Very good, Yehudit. Woman is blessed on account of her husband. Meaning, the blessing in the cup, which is generally believed to be the blessing of childbirth, is transmitted to the woman through her husband. So it is enough that the husband drink and be blessed. This is a fairly standard argument for the exclusion of women that we have seen throughout history. Women do not need to take part in something or be represented in something or participate in something because they can do so through the proxy of their husbands. Not to mention the sore subject, but until quite recently in Western history, the idea was women would vote through their husbands, so they didn't get their own vote. Let's read on, please, Anita.
Meanwhile, Yalta heard, and she got up in a passion and went to the wine storehouse and broke 400 jars of wine.
Thank you. So Yalta, here you see some of you are smiling, so you're getting the comedy. This is in fact a comedy. Yalta overhears the men's discussion and flies into a rage. She storms up to the wine store and store not in the American sense of a shop, but the storage space where they kept their wine. And Madwoman in the attic that she is, she smashes 400 jars of wine. Excuse me. So passionate is her temper, so violent and vindictive, she doesn't even care that the wine she is destroying is her own. Remember how Xanthippe stepped on the cake and Socrates said, well, you've just destroyed it for the both of us? Or Fatima throws a honey cake in her husband's face, again, destroying it for them both? Very similar here. If she can't have wine, if Yalta cannot have wine, no one is having wine. Let's read on.
Rav Nachman said to him, let the master send her another cup.
Thank you. Do you get the comedy here? His wife has just smashed 400 jars of wine, and all poor Rav Nachman can say is, please send her another cup, please, before she breaks anything else. This is a thoroughly whipped husband, as shrew husbands often are. Let's read on.
He sent it to her with a message. All that wine can be counted as a blessing.
Thank you. So Ula, given Rav Nachman's request a second time, actually agrees to send Yalta another cup, but he can't help it. He's a rabbinic messenger. He's got to teach some Torah, and so he sent it to her with a message. All that wine could be counted as a blessing. Now, this is in fact halachically true. To this day in the Shulchan Aruch, we have the law that if a blessing is recited over a cup of wine, all the wine in the vicinity becomes equally blessed. What do you think this message is meant to say to Yalta? Again, by chat. What is he trying to tell her? She could have taken any wine, very good. She wasted blessings, very good. Anything else? It doesn't matter that she smashed it, she still only gets blessed via her husband, good. I thought it meant she is still blessed, very good. So I think the first thing he's saying is, you're ignorant. You don't know the law. There is a basic law that all the wine is equally blessed. And you didn't know this. And if you did know this, you would realize that you could have drunk from any other cup. You did not need this particular cup. You just completely overreacted. Let's finish up, Anita.
He returned to answer, gossip comes from peddlers and lice from rags.
Thank you. I love this. This is one of the great comebacks in the entire Talmud. Gossip comes from peddlers and lice from rags. You can almost see at the end of that sentence. You know what I mean when I do this? My American students, I tell me I'm not American, I can't pull it off. That sort of thing. That's what I see when I read that last line. Thank you, Laura, for that validation. It's a very strange final line to the story. I will tell you quite candidly that scholars don't really know what to make of it. It's quite complicated. What do you think Yalta is saying to Ula in this final line? Was Ula a peddler? Good question, Diana. He was a merchant. She is certainly frustrated, but what is she saying? He is a gossip. Ooh, very interesting, Max. Very interesting. All right, so most scholars basically read this final line as Yalta trying to just insult Ula any which way she possibly can. As we said, Ula is a merchant, so she's basically saying, you, Ula, are nothing but a gossiping, rag-wearing, lice-infested peddler. The end. And so this, ladies and gentlemen, is the primary reading of the story of Yalta. And judging by the primary reading, what we seem to have before us is a classic shrew narrative. We've got the comedy, we've got the violence, both verbal and physical, we've got the whipped husband, and most importantly, we've got the bad-tempered mad woman who does not get her own way and unleashes her fury at anyone and anything in her path. But I want to ask, as we always must when reading a story in the Talmud, is this really the story the Talmud is telling? And with that, spoiler alert, the answer to that question is almost always going to be no. Here's perhaps the most important thing to know about rabbinic stories. One of the hallmarks of rabbinic storytelling is what I call in my book the false front. These stories are misleading. What they appear to be saying and what they are actually saying are often diametrically opposite to one another. The rabbis construct their stories so as to deliberately mislead us, such that if you only read them one time, you will come away with the wrong idea. And this is particularly true of rabbinic legends. Again, rabbinic legends, we spoke about this last week, the stories the rabbis tell about themselves. Most rabbinic legends read like the story of Yalta we just read. They're very short, they're deceptively simple, they read like folk tales. They are in fact nothing of the sort. They are incredibly intricate and complex. But you would never get that if you only read them once. And so rabbinic legends can never just be read, they must always be reread. And in this respect, one of the best methodologies I know for the reading of rabbinic stories comes to us courtesy of 20th century poet Adrienne Rich, who probably never read Talmud in her life, as far as I know, but she articulates the method really beautifully. Anita, if I can ask you to read one more time for us, we're going to look at number 19.
Revision, the act of looking back, of seeing with fresh eyes, of entering an old text from a new critical direction, is for us more than a chapter in cultural history. It is an act of survival.
Thank you. I think that is a pretty good way of describing what we need to do with rabbinic stories. We need to reread or revision them. But it's not just about technically reading a story 2 times. There is a very specific set of rules that we need to apply to our reading of rabbinic legends if we are going to actually break through the story's false front and uncover the deeper meaning that lies hidden between the lines. And the main objective of this course is to empower you to do just that. I'm going to share with you the list of reading rules for rabbinic legends, so from here on in, you should be empowered to read the stories of the Talmud on your own. And I know from student feedback that these rules prove to be equally relevant when it comes to reading biblical stories or other forms of rabbinic storytelling. Here is the rule of thumb, and then we're going to break it down. And I'm going to ask you to pay particular attention because next week you're going to be doing this on your own. So today is the day we prep the rules and I give you the instructions and you can ask your questions. And next week, you are going to be thrown in at the deep end and you will put these rules into practice yourselves in Chavruta. The rule of thumb is this: to read a story in the Talmud, any story in the Talmud, and I should say by extension in all of rabbinic literature, there are exactly 2 things we need to do. We need to zoom in and do a close reading of the text, and we need to zoom out and look at the context. And that is it. If you take nothing else away from this course, take that. Zoom into the text, zoom out to the context. And let's break those rules down so that you know what you are doing next week. And once again, I'm going to share my screen. You have this in your handout. This is the sort of thing you can dog ear and return to again and again. It's source number 20, and these are the reading rules for rabbinic literature. Excuse me. 1. Zoom in. This means doing a close reading of the text. Since these stories are literature, as we said last week, and have to be read as such, we should be analyzing these narratives as we would any other novel, short story, or play. And play in this respect is actually the most relevant genre because rabbinic stories are fundamentally scenic. They present their plot directly through dialogue and deed and mediated by long descriptions of either character or setting, which gives you the impression that you're actually watching a drama enacted on a stage. And if you start reading the stories of the Talmud as plays, you'll find that you can see them a lot more clearly than if you had just read them as narratives. And so we're going to do a close reading of this story as if it is a play. The first thing to look at, this is 20, I'm in rubric A, rule number 1, is structure. You're going to want to break the story down into different acts or scenes. And you will find, and this is a giveaway, that most rabbinic stories will neatly divide into a 3-act drama. Rabbinic storytellers were very fond of 3-act dramas. 2, setting. For every act in the story, you need to identify the time and place. Where and when does this act take place? And I mean that both in the macro, for the story in general, you want to identify when it is historically and where it is geographically. I already mentioned that the story of Yalta is set in 3rd century Babylon. But also for each act in the micro, are we indoors or are we outdoors? Is it daytime or nighttime? Is it every day or Shabbat? Are we in a public or private space? Is it important to read the story in its original language? Very good. Thank you, Suri. I'm going to get to that question. It's a very important one. Excuse me. Setting is also a very helpful way of breaking the story up into acts, because every time the time changes or the space changes, you know that this is a new act. So that is sort of a helpful way of looking at it. And we will find that rabbinic legends generally are set in a very condensed time and space, which gives the drama an air of intensity and immediacy. 3, again, I'm sorry, it's a lot of theory, but we are going to be putting all of this into practice. Characters. For every act in the story, who are the people in that act? Try and see how they're presented, their views, their personalities, their relationships with other characters in the story. And you'll find that the stories of the Talmud often have a very limited cast of characters. It's like a play for a very small troupe of actors. Characters that sort of interchange from one act to the next, kind of like a chamber play. 4, plot. Follow the storyline through. Try and understand why it develops in the particular way that it does. Try and identify parallels and contrasts, critical turning points, climaxes. And again, like the setting and like the characters, the plot line of rabbinic stories is often quite compressed and tight and therefore highly dramatic. And then finally, within our close reading, themes, motifs, and symbols. We want to try and uncover the underlying theme of the story. What is really at the base of the story? Motifs. Are there recurring elements or recurring words? And to get at recurring words or even recurring roots, Suri, yes, if we can read the story in the original Hebrew or Aramaic, we absolutely should. And if not, don't worry about it. But if you can, challenge yourself. And symbols. Are there any elements in the story that seem to point to a more abstract idea? Identifying these symbols and motifs and themes is one of the best ways of breaking through the story's false front, of going from text to subtext and uncovering the deeper message that lies hidden beneath. So that is the close reading. I'm going to pause and let you put any questions that you have in the chat box if you have any questions. Now is the time. Okay, I'm going to assume from the absence of questions that it is all clear, and I'm going to move on to the next thing we need to do, and that is zoom out and look at the context. You could do a perfect close reading of the text itself, but that is not enough. It will only get you so far. In the Talmud itself, there's a saying that the rabbis were very fond of using. Fool, cast your eye to the end of the verse. You see rabbis saying that to one another quite often within the Beit Midrash. Fool, cast your eye to the end of the verse. Meaning, it's not enough to read the text. You have to always read it in context. You have to always read it to the end. Specifically, the stories in the Talmud come to us layered within several layers of context. And we have to look at them each in turn. And so there are 4 layers of context we have to take into account, and this is rubric B. The first is the immediate context of the sugya. Please enlarge the text with pleasure. The sugya is a unit of rabbinic discussion. It begins with the opening Mishnah on which the Talmud is commenting, and it goes all the way until the next Mishnah. That is one unit, one sugya. These sugyot are intricately edited by the rabbinic editors. And you can learn a great deal about the story from the way the rabbis choose to frame it. In fact, if you only read the story and you don't read what comes before and after it, you will run the risk of missing out on vital clues to help you crack the meaning of the story. And so to understand a story, you have to be able to read what comes before it, what comes after it. Often the opening Mishnah is helpful, but certainly the passages that come directly before and directly after. Stories in the Talmud will often follow a halachic discussion, and they will clarify certain points in it. They will illustrate certain points in it. Sometimes even they will subvert certain points in it. Other times, stories will follow other stories in the Talmud as part of a story cycle. We mentioned this last week on a particular theme. Either way, we have to consider the framing of the story because the rabbis tell us a lot about the story from the way they choose to frame it. That is the first level of context to look at. 2, the broad context of rabbinic literature. Then context is the verse before. Well, the Talmud isn't exactly broken down into verses. I would say it is the passage before and the passage after, yes. Next, we have the broad context of all of rabbinic literature. Because breaking the story down into its literary units, which we just did in the close reading in A, will only get us so far. We have to understand what each of these literary units meant in the rabbinic imagination. So for every literary element that we identified when we did our close reading, we have to see how that element is used elsewhere in rabbinic literature. For instance, setting. If the story takes place on Yom Kippur, or at twilight, or during the destruction of the temple, those times mean something to the rabbis. And to understand what they mean, we have to look at other stories set in the same times. Or conversely placed, if a story takes place in the desert, or aboard a ship, or in the bedroom, those spaces also mean something. And to understand what, we need to look at other stories set in similar places. Characters. If the story features Rabbi Judah the Prince, or Shmuel, or Bruya, or a slightly more general character like the washerman. The washerman comes up in very interesting context. Or Matrona, that highborn Roman matron. All these characters mean something in the rabbinic imagination, And to understand what, we need to read other stories featuring the same characters. Plot, same goes. If the story features a seduction, or the giving of charity, or a deathbed scene, those plot elements are important, and we need to read other stories that feature the same plot elements. Ditto motifs and symbols. If the story has a snake in it, or a lamp, or a knife, these are all important elements, and we have to read other stories that have the same element in them. Now, for the purpose of this course, and what I'm going to ask you to do next week, I will give you the other texts that I think are relevant, but I don't want you to be dependent on me. In fact, I don't even want you to trust me, because maybe I'm cherry picking. Maybe I'm tampering with the evidence. You should be empowered to do this on your own. So, the Safaria app, which if you do not already have downloaded or on your computer, you should absolutely familiarize yourself with. It is a very, very useful tool for the study of Talmud. It's got a search function. And the easiest thing to do would be to put that particular character, name of place, motif into the search function, ideally going back to Sui's point in the original language, and doing a search, and then limiting the search results to just results from the Talmud and Midrash, from rabbinic literature, so you don't get biblical stuff as well, or later modern stuff, which is less relevant, and seeing how these elements come up. When it comes to characters, find the Wikipedia page. That is often a very good place to start. Or find the entry on this particular rabbi in the Jewish Encyclopedia or Encyclopedia Judaica, both of which I believe are online. And I should say characters are actually particularly important because the rabbis, I believe I said this last week, the stories of the Talmud were created by rabbis for rabbis, which means the creators assumed a high degree of knowledge in their readers. They assume that you, their reader, know all the other stories. And they draw on that knowledge when they tell a story. So if they tell you a story about Rabbi Judah the Prince, they assume that you know the other stories about him and you will bring that knowledge to bear on this particular story. So that is important. Next layer of context is world literature. What I said, zooming out even more broadly, I should say, we need to sometimes look for the meaning of these different literary elements, not just within rabbinic literature, but within other literatures of the same time. The rabbis did not live in a vacuum. They were very much influenced by the cultures in which they lived, the Greco-Roman culture to the west and the Persian culture to the east. And so if there's a story with a snake, sometimes we will find the meaning of the snake not in other snake stories in the Talmud, but rather in Greek mythology. And so it's helpful to be familiar with that as well. And then finally, the rabbinic world, the historical context. The stories of the Talmud are removed from us by a good millennium and a half. And we can never ever assume that anything in these stories is in any way like our own reality. And you'd be surprised how many very seasoned Talmudists make this mistake. I'll give you an example. There's a wonderful story in the Midrash about a woman who goes to synagogue every Friday night to hear a rabbi speak. And then one day the rabbi goes overtime and the candle in her home goes out. And her husband is furious that she came home so late. And he says, "You will not be allowed back into my house until you spit in the face of that rabbi." And the story continues from there. It's a wonderful story. Now, many readers say, oh, well, a candle burning out, a candle is this long, waxy, tapery thing. It's a phallic symbol, clearly. And there is an allusion here to a missed opportunity for marital relations, which would be true were it not for the fact that that is not what the Talmud means when it speaks about a candle. Because candles in rabbinic times were not these long tapery things, they were actually Aladdin lamps, which means the candle here is not a phallic symbol, it is rather a vaginal symbol. And that leads to a very, very different reading of the story. For instance, going back to the story of Yalta, we needed to know that Ula was a rabbinic messenger and that his job was to communicate words of Torah from Israel to Babylon, or else we would not understand what is happening in this story. And so we really do need to familiarize ourselves with the social conventions, the political climate, the cultural mores, the economic structures, the scientific knowledge, and the material culture of the rabbinic world. And if you're unfamiliar with any of these aspects, you can do what I do, which is honestly just Google. And again, no fear. For the purposes of this class, whatever historical information we need to know, I will give you. All right, so that is the zooming out the different layers of context. If there are any questions, please do put them in the chat window, and we will continue to one final set of rules I want to share with you. All right, I'm going to assume it's all clear, and I'm going to expect you all to be absolutely brilliant next week when I set you to work. The final thing we need to know are three reading hypotheses, three assumptions that we need to bring to bear onto these stories as we read them. The first one should be familiar to you if you've ever learnt Bible, and that is omnisignificance. The stories, as I mentioned, are extremely short. They're incredibly compact and terse. There are worlds and worlds of drama held together in like 3 short lines. They are minimalistic. There are various reasons for this minimalism. The main one is the fact that these stories had to be orally transmitted from one generation to the next, and so they had to be boiled down to make it easy for people to remember. Which means nothing in these highly compact stories is extraneous. Every single sentence, every single clause, every single word is there for a reason. Everything must be questioned. Anita, you have a question, I can see. Did the rabbis of Israel Babylon have me? Oh, that is such a good question. There is a lot of tension oftentimes between the rabbis of Israel and Babylon because they at this point are vying for leadership over the Jewish world. And that may or may not be relevant to the story of Yalta. I'm going to let you think about that next week. And so very much in the same way that we would read biblical literature, in rabbinic literature, we must assume that every single unit of meaning is there for a reason. 2, interiority. This is a good one. The stories of the Talmud, as I said, are scenic. They tell us, very much like in plays, what characters say or do, but not what they think or feel. They give us the objective reality of act and speech, but not the subjective reality of thought and emotion. And so it is up to us, the readers, because just because we're not told what the characters are feeling doesn't mean there's not a lot of emotional drama happening. More often than not, the real drama of this story is in the emotional subtext. And so it is up to us as the readers to try and get into the heads and the hearts of the characters, try and tease out the unstated thoughts and emotions. And then finally, what I call axiology, or what you might simply refer to as the moral of the story. I mentioned last week that the stories of the Talmud didn't actually happen. But just because they didn't actually happen doesn't mean they're not true. There is a profound truth to these stories, but it is not a historical truth. It is an ethical, religious, or philosophical truth. The rabbis told their stories not to record history, as I mentioned last week, but to teach us how to, quote, know God and cleave to his ways, if you remember the text that we read last week. And so the final question that you have to ask yourselves when reading the story in the Talmud is, why are the rabbis telling us this? What is the lesson that they would like for us to learn? I'm going to say one more thing. And again, if you have any questions on anything I just said, please do put it in the chat. These reading rules so far are fairly standard. I did not invent them. You'll find different scholars of Agadah using them. I want to add one more thing, which is slightly more unique to the way I specifically read rabbinic literature. You can take or leave this as you will, but we are going to be using it in this particular course. And that is archetypal criticism. Archetypal criticism is a well-known literary approach which isn't really applied to the study of Talmud, at least not systematically, although it really should be, because it is an incredibly rich and fruitful way to read these stories. Archetypal criticism is based on the thought of Sigmund Freud and Carl Gustav Jung, who basically posit that telling stories is one of the best ways we humans have of working through our primal fears and fantasies. The stories that we tell, all the way from ancient Chinese myth to contemporary Hollywood movies, are all basically the same because they are all a working out of our primal emotions, what Jung calls the collective unconscious. And so if we see a particular archetype, and by archetype I mean a character type, or a literary motif, or a plot line, if we see a particular archetype recurring in stories throughout history and across cultures, we can assume with a high degree of probability that the root of this archetype is psychological, that it is derived deep from within the human psyche. And so what an archetypal critic generally will do when reading a story is A, try and identify its archetypes, those elements that the text has in common with other stories from other literatures, and B, try and uncover the psychological motivation, the primal fear or fantasy that this particular archetype expresses. And we'll be doing some of that, not next week, but the week after that, in the final week of the course. We already kind of did because, as I mentioned, the shrew is an archetype. And so we're going to have to think about why is it that every single culture, and really every single culture, we've seen this, has a story of this bad-tempered mad woman who lives to make her husband's life a living hell. All right, those are the rules for reading rabbinic stories. And here's what I'm going to ask you to do next week. I'm going to ask you to take these rules. Once again, I'm going to just share my screen. And I'm going to ask you to apply them to the story we just read, the story of Yalta, and see if you can come up with an interpretation. So here's what I'm going to ask you to do. And again, take note of this now, because next week I'm going to basically send you directly into Chavruta groups, and you're going to have to dive right in. I want you to do a close reading of the story as it appears in number 18. And I will do my best to supply you with the actual original text, because Soy is right. If you can, you should be looking at it in the original. Break the story down into acts or scenes. Identify where and when each of the acts takes place. Identify the characters in each act. How they are presented to us, what kind of people they are, and what their relationships are like. There's something very interesting in the dynamics between the different people in this story. Identify the storyline. Try and figure out why it develops the way that it does. And perhaps most importantly, look out for important symbols. There are at least 2 very important symbols in the story of Yalta, and if you can figure out what they are and what they symbolize, you will have cracked the story. Next, I'm going to ask you to zoom out and look at the story in its different layers of context. I'm going to refer you to the immediate context of the story. This will be in the handout, the passage that comes directly before the story, and which will help you shed light on why the rabbis are telling us this story in the first place. We're going to look, okay, let me ask you this. If the broad context of all of rabbinic literature, if we have to look for other elements in our story, other places they appear, what would you go looking for? If you wanted to understand the story of Yalta that we just read, what kind of searches would you do elsewhere in rabbinic literature? What would you search for? What of the literary elements in the story would you look for? Wine, tables, and meals. Okay, very good. So actually, wine will be in the immediate context of the story. The cup of blessing too. Vessels is interesting. We'll talk about that. You're all talking about actual objects or abstract ideas. So guest is a really interesting one, that maybe the rabbinic culture of hospitality. Lice is very interesting. We'll talk about that. You're missing, I think, one key element in this story. Interactions between who? Specifically. Conflict between West and East, very good. Husband and wife, men versus women. Okay, very good. I would say the first thing we want to look for is Yalta. We want to look at other Yalta stories to see what kind of person she is. She's the heroine of this story. Let's try and figure her out. And I mentioned that Yalta appears she's named more than any other woman in rabbinic literature. So I'm going to ask you to look at some other Yalta stories to try and figure out exactly what kind of woman she is. Next, world literature. Well, we kind of did that when we looked at different Shrew stories, so I'm going to bracket that. And the rabbinic world. Again, there's a lot of historical context that is relevant to the story, like the fact that women don't sit at the table with the men, like the rabbinic messengers who travel backwards and forwards between Israel and Babylon, which, thanks to Anita's question, you now know are two rabbinic centers that actually have quite a bit of tension between them. There's additional stuff to know about the historical context, which is critical to understanding the story, but I will bring that into the class that we have following the Chavruta, so do not worry about that. And then finally, I want you to bring the 3 working hypotheses to bear on the story. Look closely at each and every word. Get yourselves into the heads of the characters. Try and figure out why they say and do what they say and do. And finally, try and figure out what the moral of the story is. What is it that the rabbis wished to teach us? I'll give you a clue. Women for the rabbis were the ultimate other. And so when the rabbis tell a story of a woman, 9 times out of 10, they tell us a story of an other. And through these stories, they impart moral messages about how to treat the other in our midst. And so that is a useful way to think about this story. What is the moral lesson that the rabbis wish to teach us about how we should and should not be treating the other? Don't mess with your wife. May or may not be one of them. I think that would depend on how you define mess, because arguably there are certain rabbis in the Talmud who absolutely do mess with their wives. But I will let you think about that when you Chavruta next week. All right, that was a lot of theory. I'm going to pause, and I'm going to also let yourself at this point unmute yourself if there are any questions or comments. Again, threw a lot of theory at you, but next week we put it into practice, and so now is your chance to ask whatever it is you would like to ask, whatever it is that might still be unclear, if you have any thoughts or insights on anything we just said. Okay, so Anita asks, is it cheating if we use your book? No, I'm going to basically tell you exactly what, my actual book, not the handout, the actual book. Well, if you use my book, you kind of know where I'm going with the story, and I don't want my thoughts to bias your own. I want you to come up with your own thoughts. Again, never trust a teacher. Figure it out for yourself. So how do we know that our interpretation is true or valid? That is a fantastic question, Ariel. Let's talk about that for a minute. I say in my book that, excuse me, reading is a relationship. Reading is a relationship. It's not unlike a relationship that we would have with a significant other in our lives. And the reading specifically of the Talmud, if we look at it historically, there are 4 different models of reading that Jews have taken with regards to the Talmud, which correspond to 4 different modes of relationship. The first mode of relationship is rejection. You might say to another person, look, you and I were too different. This is never going to work between us. Can't happen. And this has been a response that we've seen very much since the advent of modernity, when the gaps between what we believe and what the Talmud tells us, scientifically, politically, ethically, philosophically, have just grown wider and wider. Many Jews basically said, look, I'm too different to the Talmud. I cannot have a relationship with it. And they've walked away. I'm sorry, Kayla, I'm not going to read the direct message just now because I'm essentially a man and I can't multitask. The second mode of relationship is subjection. Or rather, I should say, sorry. The second mode of relationship is accommodation. And it goes something like this. You and I are very different, but I want this relationship to work so badly, I'm going to change everything about myself so that we can be together. Not a very healthy way to have a relationship, and not a very healthy way to read a text. And yet that is a mode of reading that we find very often on the right, so as not to say the ultra-Orthodox community, that deal with the gaps between themselves and what the Talmud says by basically saying, well, if the Talmud says this and I think that, I must be wrong. Therefore, I'm going to change my views so that they accommodate those in the text. In this model, the reader loses their identity to the text. A third model is what I call, what do I call it? Sorry, it's been a very long day. Subjection. And it goes something like this. You and I are very different. We can have this relationship if you want, but then I'm going to ask you to go ahead and change everything about you. This is a response that we often find on the left. And I'm going to say it's probably the one that we must be the most careful of. It's the response where we go imposing our own beliefs, our own biases, our own preconceived notions onto the text. We make the text lose its integrity so that we can preserve our own. And then the final mode of relationship, a model of reading, is what I call negotiation. And this is the one that I try and adopt when I read the stories of the Talmud. You and I are very different. We both want this relationship to succeed. So I'm going to come into it with all of my beliefs and my biases, and you will do the same, and we will negotiate to make it work. It's not just the most healthy way to have a relationship, it is also the most ethical way to read a text. We have to bring our full selves to the encounter with the Talmudic text, and we must also allow the Talmud to bring its full self to its encounter with us. The Talmud is very much fashioned by antiquity, and we are no less fashioned by our 21st century liberalism. So we have our biases and the Talmud has its biases, and then we negotiate, and then we look at our differences. If we're going to read the Talmud on its terms rather than our own, we have to be prepared to listen even when the Talmud doesn't say what we want to hear. And so how do we make sure that we're actually not imposing our biases onto the text? Well, one thing is to be very aware of our own biases. The other thing is precisely the reading rules. I write about these rules in my book precisely because I want to give readers a way of making sure that the way they're reading the text at least approximates, at least tries to come close to what the original meaning of the authors might have been. And so if you know these rules and you apply them as rigorously and as intellectually honestly to the text as you possibly can, you can be fairly confident that you're in the right track to interpretation. That was a very long answer, but to a very important question. Kayla, if you want to email me that private message, I can respond to it when I'm not actually speaking, or you can stay on after and we can discuss. The Talmud seems, at least sometimes, to impose its view on the Bible. Ooh, Susanna, that is such a good point. Yes, you are absolutely right. The rabbis themselves, I just said, do not read yourselves into the text. Make sure the text is allowed to speak its own language. The rabbis don't do that. The rabbis will very often impose themselves and their own reality onto the Bible. I will say in defense of the rabbis, when they do that, it's not because they're pretending that this is what the biblical author actually meant. They are very candidly reading themselves into the Bible. They're not pretending to expose the original meaning. If in my answer to Ariel, I spoke about trying to approximate the original meaning, the rabbis, when they do creative midrash, creative biblical interpretation, they're not trying to approximate the original intent of the biblical author. They're basically doing a creative reading to show that the Bible's reality is actually just like their reality today, 1,000 years later. But everyone knows that that is a rabbinic fiction. All right, so with that, I'm going to wish you a very good week, and I look forward to seeing you in a week's time where I will be stateside and waking up very early in the morning because I'll be on the West Coast so that I may spend time with all of you. So Shavuot, everyone. I'll see you next week.
All right. Thank you, everyone who joined us today. We look forward to seeing you next week. There are more classes with Drisha going on as part of our Small Fallsman. You can check out our offerings at drisha.org/classes. And with that, take care and happy learning.